Imagine, if you will, the very heart of English power, the court of Elizabeth I, a place where every whisper was a political act, every bow a declaration of loyalty, and every movement a meticulously rehearsed dance of power. The air here was thick with the scent of roses and intrigue, and the walls seemed to have absorbed centuries of submission and grandeur. And then, into this shimmering yet suffocating labyrinth of absolute monarchy, she burst in. Not with a bow, not with a plea, but with a defiance that echoed through every European court and was forever etched into the annals of history as an act of unprecedented audacity. Grace O'Malley, pirate, queen, killer. She arrived in London not as a supplicant, but as a sovereign, stepping onto foreign soil with the same unyielding pride with which her galleys plied the waters of the Irish Sea. Her dress, Irish to its core, sharply contrasted with the silks and brocades of the court ladies, and her grey eyes, accustomed to scanning the horizon for enemy ships, did not flinch before the golden gleam of the Tudor crown. And when she was led to the Virgin Queen herself, to the one who could decide the fate of entire nations with a single word, Grace showed not the slightest tremor. Elizabeth, accustomed to prostrations, trembling voices, and pleading gazes, encountered something entirely different. It is said that during the audience, Grace, feeling the need, simply spat on the floor. Right onto the meticulously kept, perhaps even richly adorned floor of the royal palace. Not to the side, not into a handkerchief, but defiantly, making no secret of her disdain for the stifling ceremonialism, the false politeness, the very idea that she should abide by anyone's rules on foreign soil. This seemingly primitive gesture was, in fact, an act of profound, almost philosophical, defiance. It was a spit not just on the floor, but on the entire English court, on all its conventions, on Elizabeth's very claim to absolute power over Ireland. It was a spit of freedom, wild and untamed, in the face of a civilization that sought to subjugate her. Imagine the shock. Courtiers froze, their faces contorted with horror and outrage. No one, absolutely no one, dared to behave that way in Elizabeth's presence. But the Queen, herself not lacking in iron will and shrewdness, did not explode. She likely saw in this woman not merely a barbarian, but a mirror reflection of her own equally harsh and ruthless nature. This act was not one of ignorance, it was an act of power. Power not over lands or armies, but power over herself, over her own instincts, over her wild, Irish essence, which she refused to subjugate to anyone. Grace did not request an audience. She demanded it. She did not ask for mercy. She demanded equality. And with this single, seemingly crude gesture, she set entirely new rules for the game, forcing Elizabeth herself to recognize that she faced not merely a rebel, but a queen without a crown, whose throne was carved from the waves of the Irish Sea and forged in the fire of endless battles. This moment is not just an anecdote. It is a pivotal, almost mystical juncture where two of the greatest women of their era converged, each in their own way embodying the highest degree of sovereignty. One, absolute monarchy, the other, absolute primal freedom. And their meeting was not a negotiation, but rather a duel of wills, where the rules were dictated by the one who cared least for them. But to understand how such a woman could even come into being, how her character was forged into such an unyielding and unbreakable alloy, we must delve into the depths of her own far more brutal and merciless world. A world where survival was an art, and power the only currency. We have seen her, Grace O'Malley, in the heart of English might, in the golden captivity of the Virgin Queen's court. A woman who spat on the palace marble did not merely defy etiquette. She spat on the very idea of submission, on imperial pretensions, on the myth of superiority. But to comprehend this audacity, this unshakable pride, one must delve into the darkness from which she emerged. Where did this Irish storm come from? This woman who dared to consider herself an equal to a monarch. Her story doesn't begin in majestic halls, but in salty spray, amidst the blood-soaked rocks of Western Connaught. Imagine not the Ireland we know from tourist brochures, but a wild, primal land. Shores scourged by the Atlantic, where every stone remembered battles, and every clan was a law unto itself. This was not a country where princesses were born. It was a forge for warriors and survivors. Grace O'Malley was born into this chaos, at the epicenter of clan feuds, pirate raids, and the constant, suffocating pressure of the English crown. Her cradle was not silk, but a ship's deck, and her lullaby the creak of masts and the roar of the surf. Her father, Dubh Dire O'Malley, was not just a chieftain. He was a sea king, whose dominion stretched not over lands, but over waves. He traded, plundered, forged alliances and broke them, guided by one law alone, the law of profit and survival. In this world, there was no place for weakness, especially not for a girl. But Grace was no ordinary girl. Legend has it that in her youth, she cut off her long hair so her father would take her to sea, as women, by superstition, brought bad luck aboard. This wasn't just a charming tale of a rebel. It was the first act of her self-determination, a declaration that she would not accept the role prescribed for her. She did not wish to be an appendage, a man's shadow. She wanted to be a force acting independently, and was willing to disfigure herself to get what she wanted. This was the first scar on her soul, self-inflicted in pursuit of power, freedom, and the right to exist. But the true transformation, that point of no return, that forever changed her, turning her into a ruthless strategist, occurred later. She was not just a chieftain's daughter. She was part of a clan where blood and succession were intertwined with intrigue and violence. When the question of power arose, of control over the fleet and lands, Grace did not back down. It is said that her brother, the heir by birthright, was eliminated. Eliminated not by enemies, not by accident, but by a hand that was perhaps guided by her own. Or at the very least, she did not flinch when that hand acted. This was not an act of desperation. It was an act of cold calculation, an act of eliminating a rival who hindered her ascent. Imagine that moment. The killing of one's own brother for a throne, for control over a pirate clan. What does that do to a person's soul? It burns away the remnants of innocence, discards all conventions. It plunges you into an abyss where survival and power become the only gods. On that day, Grace O'Malley ceased to be merely a daughter or a sister. She became the architect of her own destiny, carved from stone and blood. She understood that true power is not given, it is taken. She realized that to preserve the clan, and her own position at its head, one must be prepared for anything. This act became the foundation of her worldview. Pragmatism bordering on cynicism, ruthlessness justified by necessity, and an unwavering belief in her own right to rule. It was then that she became a queen, even before her name resonated throughout Ireland and reached Elizabeth's ears. It was then that she began to weave that web of intrigue and conquest that would make her a legend, and her methods a source of both admiration and terror. We left Grace O'Malley on the threshold of true power, a woman who coolly wrested her destiny from the clutches of a patriarchal world and clan feuds. But it is one thing to assert oneself. It is another to hold and multiply what has been seized. And here begins the most captivating, most ruthless game, in which Grace proved herself not merely as a pirate, but as the architect of her own empire, a woman whose will was harder than iron, and whose mind sharper than a dagger. Her dominion over the western seas of Ireland was not a chaotic raid by brigands. It was a meticulously constructed, well-thought-out system, where every raid, every capture, every strategic marriage was a step towards consolidating power, towards creating her own sovereign state upon the waves. She didn't just plunder. She governed, exacting tribute, establishing her laws, transforming chaos into a profitable, deadly order. First alliance, the O'Flaherty clan and the shadow of death. The plan. To expand her domains and strengthen her position in strategically important Connemara, Grace turned her gaze to the powerful but unstable O'Flaherty clan. Their leader, Donnell of the Battles O'Flaherty, was an experienced warrior and owned Ballinahone Castle, a jewel on the shores of Clew Bay. For Grace, this was not a marriage of love, but a military alliance, a merger of fleets and territories, a way to seize control of new sea routes and solidify her governmental authority over trade. Execution. In 1566, Grace O'Malley married Donnell. It was a union of two predators, each perfectly understanding the price of power and survival. Under her leadership, the O'Malley and O'Flaherty fleets united, transforming into an invincible force dominating the entire western coast. They didn't just raid, they established tolls on passing ships, levied taxes on coastal settlements, offering protection from other pirates, or from themselves to be precise. It was a classic protection racket, but on the scale of an entire kingdom, where Grace acted as a shadow monarch and her ships as the revenue police. Unexpected turn. Just 1 year after the wedding, Donnell of the Battles was killed in an ambush, presumably during a skirmish with the rival Joyce clan. His death was sudden and, for Grace, impossibly timely. According to legend, which seems almost too perfect to be accidental, Grace shed no tear upon learning of her husband's demise. Instead, utilizing an ancient Irish custom that allowed a widow to gain control of her husband's property for 1 year, she secured Ballinahone Castle and all the O'Flaherty possessions. When the year expired, and Donnell's clan attempted to reclaim their lands, Grace simply locked the castle gates and declared their marriage dissolved. "I divorce you," she reportedly shouted, securing not only the castle but also the legend of her ruthless pragmatism. Consequences. Donnell's death did not weaken Grace. On the contrary, it catapulted her to a new level of power. She became the Dark Lady of Duna, the undisputed mistress of Ballinahone and the O'Flaherty fleet. Her reputation as a woman capable of using any circumstance, even a husband's death, to achieve her goals, only strengthened. Now she controlled 2 powerful clan fleets and extensive territories, transforming from a clan chieftain into a regional sovereign whose power stretched from sea to mountains. Second alliance. Iron. Richard and the strategic castle. The plan. But even with such power, Grace understood that her position remained vulnerable. The English crown was increasing pressure and internal clan feuds did not subside. She needed an even more powerful ally who could provide political cover and access to new resources. Her choice fell upon Richard Burke, known as Iron Richard, or Richard in Iron, an influential baron whose holdings included the strategically vital Rockfleet Castle, Carrigahallie Castle, on the shores of Clew Bay. This marriage was another cold, calculated deal aimed at strengthening her political and military influence. Execution. In 1575, Grace O'Malley married Richard Burke. This was, in essence, an agreement for the merger of assets. Richard gained access to her fleet and military might, and Grace, to his lands, political weight, and importantly, to Rockfleet, an impregnable fortress ideally suited for her pirate base. It was here, in this castle, that they lived, and it was here that Grace gave birth to her last son, Tibbet of the Ships, Tibbet na Longboard, so named because, according to legend, he was born on a ship. The marriage of Grace and Richard was tumultuous, full of passion and conflict, but it withstood the test of time because both understood its strategic value. Grace continued her maritime operations, using the castle as her headquarters, while Richard, being a baron recognized by the English crown, provided a degree of legitimacy to their joint actions, although his wife continued to openly defy English authority. Unexpected turn. The relationship between Grace and Richard was far from idyllic. Conflicts constantly plagued them, and according to one account, Grace even once took Richard captive to force him to submit to her will. Their union was more a partnership of 2 strong personalities than a traditional marriage. However, the true turn was how Grace used this marriage for her own enrichment and consolidation of power. When Richard was captured by the English, Grace did not cease her operations. On the contrary, she used his predicament to further strengthen her own connections and independence, demonstrating that her power did not depend on a man. Consequences. Rockfleet Castle became the impregnable heart of her maritime empire, a citadel from which she commanded her vast fleet. This marriage gave her not only political protection, but also an heir who would later play a key role in her struggle for survival. Grace, now no longer just a pirate but a baroness, continued to wage her own war against English dominion, using her governmental status, through her husband, to legitimize her actions and enrich herself, while her ships continued to raid and levy tribute. She was the embodiment of a paradox, wife of a crown-loyal baron, and simultaneously the primary naval threat to the English presence in Ireland. The fleet and conquests, becoming Queen of the Seas. The merging of clans, strategic marriages, the capture of castles, all were part of one grand strategy. Grace O'Malley commanded a fleet of dozens of vessels, from swift galleons to powerful barks, crewed by hundreds of desperate cutthroats. These men were devoted to her not only out of fear, but also for the promise of immense wealth, and importantly, because Grace was one of them. She stood on deck beside them, fought, shared the spoils and the risks. Her leadership was absolute, her orders, law. The capture of castles was not merely an act of aggression, but a demonstration of her military might and strategic thinking. She besieged and took fortresses, such as Dublin Castle, Rockfleet, and others, solidifying her territorial holdings. These castles became not just refuges, but strongholds for her maritime operations, storehouses for plunder, and centers of her governmental activity. She was not merely a pirate. She was the head of a de facto independent state, whose budget was replenished by sea raiding and whose laws were written at the point of a sword. However, the more Grace amassed her power, the wider her domains became, the more inevitable became her clash with those forces that could not tolerate an independent, uncontrolled ruler on their borders, especially when that ruler was a woman who refused to bow before any authority but her own. And it was these invisible, yet omnipotent forces that began to tighten the noose around the Irish storm. Grace O'Malley was not a lone wolf, emerging from nowhere. She was a product, and simultaneously, the architect of a complex, seething ecosystem, whose invisible currents of energy fueled her power and ambition. Her empire, built on salt and blood, was sustained not only by her iron will, but also by the ancient doctrinal ties of Ireland's clan system. These were not merely gangs of thugs, they were her blood brothers, her loyal enforcers, bound by oaths stronger than chains. Loyalty in Clan Ireland was not just a word, it was a religion, passed down through generations. And Grace, as the high priestess of this cult, skillfully manipulated these threads, creating a network of unwavering devotion that allowed her to defy the crown itself. Against the backdrop of this Irish storm, the English administration in Dublin appeared as a caricature of power, fragmented, corrupt, perpetually mired in its own squabbles, and incapable of understanding the mentality of Irish chieftains. Their attempts to impose order were as effective as trying to tame a tsunami with a fork. Local English governors, like Sir Richard Bingham, were obsessed with the idea of civilizing the Irish, which in practice meant their complete subjugation and the destruction of any form of independence. This fundamental weakness and misunderstanding on the part of the English bureaucracy granted Grace not just room to maneuver, but an entire arena for building her own state. And above it all, somewhere in London, sat Elizabeth I, a queen who paradoxically was both Grace's primary threat and her unwitting patron. As long as Elizabeth was preoccupied with Spain, France, internal conspiracies, and the threat of Catholic invasion, Ireland remained for her merely a troublesome thorn, a secondary concern. This indifference, this detachment, essentially granted Grace freedom of action. Elizabeth, unknowingly, created a power vacuum that Grace gladly filled, transforming the western seas into her personal domain. But even in this chaos, where Grace seemed invincible, shadows surrounded her, ready to consume her. The main antagonist, of course, was the English crown, not abstract, but embodied in its viceroys, whose paranoid hatred of Irish chieftains was almost palpable. For them, Grace was not just a pirate, but a symbol of defiance that had to be destroyed at all costs. They saw in her not a woman, but the embodiment of an ancient, wild Irish spirit that refused to bow. However, the enemies were not only external. Sometimes the sharpest daggers were plunged into her back from within. Take Richard Burke, her second husband, Iron Richard. Their marriage was a union of strength, a calculation, not a passion. And as political winds shifted, so did their relationship. Irish chronicles whisper of his attempts to distance himself from the pirate queen when English pressure became too strong. He, the man who should have been her support, became a potential threat, balancing between loyalty to the crown and a residual respect for his wife, who was too formidable to ignore. His ambitions, his fear of English reprisal, his own struggle for power in Connaught, all created a dynamic, constantly shifting conflict within their marriage, where each side used the other as a shield and sword. And the most insidious of all wounds, betrayal. Even the most formidable leaders have their Achilles heel, and for Grace, it was one of her own captains, a man to whom she entrusted her ships and, perhaps, a part of her soul. The motives? Envy of her power? Fear of inevitable downfall? Money offered by the English? Or simply the desire to survive in a world where loyalty was a commodity and betrayal a price? This act was not merely a blow, but a crack in the foundation of her power. Proof that even the strongest bonds, forged in blood and oaths, could be severed. These internal fissures, these whispers of betrayal, these eternal dances with death and power, all created not just a historical chronicle, but a true psychological thriller. Grace O'Malley did not merely fight the English. She fought for control over her own destiny, over her clan, over the very concept of independence in a world that sought to engulf her. Every raid, every victory, every marriage, it was not just a move on the chessboard of history, but a desperate attempt to survive, to fortify herself, to plant her flag in soil drenched in blood and betrayal. But even the most formidable fortress, built on sand and blood, can collapse. And even the most untamed storm eventually crashes against rocks it cannot overcome. The fate of the Irish pirate queen seemed predetermined when the invisible threads of conspiracy and state interest began to tighten around her neck, promising an inevitable downfall. The westerly winds that had whispered Grace O'Malley's name for centuries suddenly turned into a storm threatening to engulf not only her fleet, but the legend itself. The empire she so audaciously scorned finally gathered its strength to strike back. This was not merely a clash of armies or ships, it was a psychological duel, where every move, every word carried the weight of life or death. The fall began not with the roar of cannons, but with a whisper of envy, fear, and finally, betrayal. The internal fissures that Grace seemed to have so skillfully mended revealed themselves. One of her own trusted captains, whose name history would prefer to forget as a mark of shame, sold her out for a handful of English gold and a promise of immunity. He knew her roots, her vulnerabilities, her secret harbors. And so, on one of those misty Irish dawns, when the sea merged with the sky, a flotilla of English ships, led by this Judas, caught the Sea Queen by surprise. It was not a battle, but an ambush. Grace, accustomed to victories, found herself trapped. Her famous audacity for the first time met an insurmountable wall of numbers and surprise. She was captured, not in battle, not on a blood-soaked deck, but at the moment she least expected it, on shore, in one of those coves where she felt safe. Then followed hell. She was thrown into the damp, foul-smelling dungeons of Dublin Castle, a symbol of English occupation. Iron shackles, cold stone, a despair that could break anyone. But not Grace O'Malley. In her every movement, even in chains, an untamed will was palpable. Days stretched into years, but her mind, sharp as a blade, worked tirelessly. And then, when the walls seemed destined to crush her completely, she did the unthinkable. The details of her escape are still shrouded in myth, but one thing is clear. She broke out of that tomb. Perhaps it was cunning, perhaps bribery, or perhaps something more sinister that caused her jailers to look away. Imagine a woman, shackled in chains, outwitting an entire security system to breathe the salty air of freedom once more. It was an act of pure primal survival, worthy of the darkest thrillers. But freedom proved ephemeral. The English crown could not allow a figure like Grace to roam freely in Ireland. The chase was relentless. The Irish storm, just escaped from its cage, was once again captured. This time, a trial awaited her. Not a secret proceeding, but a public spectacle in London, designed to humiliate and break her spirit before all the English nobility. The accusations were monstrous: piracy, rebellion, high treason. The death penalty hung over her like a sword of Damocles. The courtroom was filled with contempt and fear. Lords and ladies gazed at her like a strange beast, tamed and doomed. But Grace did not break. She stood before them, head unbowed, asking for no mercy. Her eyes burned with the same fire as they did on her ship's deck. She listened to the accusations as if they were addressed to someone else, not to her, the Queen of the Seas. And when it was her turn to speak, she did what she did best: manipulate. Her final, brilliant chess game played out not on a board, but in Elizabeth II's throne room. It was not a plea, but a negotiation. Grace, standing before the Queen not as a prisoner but as an equal, proposed a deal. She did not ask for a pardon. She demanded it in exchange for something far more valuable to Elizabeth than her own head. She offered the pacification of Ireland. Not subjugation, but pacification. Who, if not she, knew this land, its clans, its untamed spirit? Who, if not she, could tame the chaos that so drained the English treasury and vexed the Queen? She, who was the embodiment of this chaos, now offered to become its tamer. It was a masterful move, pure power psychology, offering a solution to a problem you yourself created, while pretending to be the only one capable of solving it. Elizabeth, weary of the endless wars and intrigues on the Green Isle, saw a chance. And she, the Queen of England, made a deal with the Irish pirate. Grace O'Malley received a pardon. Freedom in exchange for a promise that, as time would show, was as multifaceted and cunning as Grace herself. Her life after this moment, her further role in Ireland's destiny, and most importantly, her true motives, will be the subject of our deepest analysis. For history is not always as simple as it seems at first glance, and behind every heroic act may lie a cold calculation. After that audience, after that deal, what truly changed? Grace O'Malley did not become a court lady. She remained herself, the embodiment of an indomitable will. And it is here that lies the most chilling, most uncomfortable lesson of her life, one that echoes in every modern news headline. Her methods were not merely piracy or plunder. It was a sophisticated dance between force and diplomacy, between threat and promise. Don't we see it today? In the offices where the destinies of nations are decided, in the stock markets where billions change hands, in the dark corners of the internet where webs of deceit are spun. Modern Grace O'Malleys wear couture suits, sit in parliamentary seats, and run corporate giants. They don't wield boarding pikes, but their words are sharp, their strategies ruthless, and their ability to manipulate reality is a new form of artillery. They know how to turn chaos into capital, an opponent's weakness into their own strength, and fear into a tool of control. Like Grace, they understand a fundamental truth. Power isn't given, it's taken. And it doesn't matter if it's a throne or a CEO's chair, a pirate ship, or a multinational corporation. The rules are set by those who dare to break them, then rewrite them. And we, as a society, on one hand condemn them, yet on the other, we can't look away. We admire their audacity, their ability to push boundaries, their unwavering self-assurance. This isn't just a story about a pirate. It's a mirror reflecting our own, not always flattering nature. And here we come to the most troubling question. What does this eternal drive for domination, for reshaping the world to one's will, say about us? Why do we so often surrender our freedom to those who promise order, but deliver only a new form of tyranny? Why are we so fascinated by those who dare to challenge, even if that challenge is directed against us? Even after her death, Grace O'Malley remained a mystery. Legend has it she was buried in the family crypt on Clare Island, but her body was never found. It vanished, as if the very earth couldn't contain this Irish tempest. Or perhaps it was her final posthumous act of defiance, another audacious act attributed to her. When Lord Howth, one of her adversaries, denied her hospitality, she kidnapped his son, returning him only after he promised to keep his castle gates open to all travelers, an eternal testament to her power, her ability to impose her will even on the most unyielding. The gates of Howth remain open to this day. But what remains of the one who forced them open? Just the wind carrying echoes of her laughter across the centuries, or something more? What if we still live in a world shaped by individuals like Grace, without even realizing?